Next we have a Priest / Warlock spell, Raise Dead. 0 mana, deal 3 damage to your hero. Return 2 friendly minions that died this game to your hand. This is a really interesting card with a lot of different synergies to it. So like it's a 0 mana card that makes it quite good for activating Spell Burst. It deals 3 damage to your hero, so that can enable like Flush Giant and Brittlebone Destroyer, and then even more stuff in Warlock with like Dark Glare, Diseased Vulture. Actually a lot of synergy out of punching yourself in the face for 3. But even outside those synergies, it just seems like kind of a good card. You can sort of look at it as just 0 mana draw 2. Draw 2 cards that are like actually in your deck. And that just seems really strong. Like you can be playing a Zoo deck, and then you get back... Well, I guess Zoo has some pretty low value 1-drops, but there's still 1-drops that you can jam with your Magic Carpet. Or sometimes you get back a Magic Carpet, or hell, sometimes you can get back an Imprisoned Scrap Imp and then just buff your hand again. You can get back one of these discard things to discard Hand of Gul'dan again. Just pretty solid in Zoo. But on the other end of the spectrum, it's also just like pretty good in a Control Priest deck. Like any minion that you're hitting, getting back to your hand, is pretty damn good value. That's the reason that you're playing these minions in your Control Priest deck in the first place, right? It's generally going to be skewed toward early game minions, just because it's kind of hard to like play Murozond, have it die, and then at that point you're still just like 1 in 10 or whatever to get Murozond back. But even though it's skewed toward early game minions, like if you just play this on turn 4 and get back a Disciple of Galakrond and a Madame Lazul, that's just pretty damn good value. You can play this in like Buff Priest to get back your like Frazzled Freshman or whatever. That's pretty good as well. I don't know if Quest Warlock would necessarily want to play this because like late game questing explorers aren't super good. You're not always going to have mana to play the cards you already have anyway in a deck that's life tapping a lot, so getting like an extra 6-drop might not be super good. But I think there are definitely overall a lot of different archetypes that could be interested in this. Of course, it's not all upside though. Dealing 3 damage to your hero is a pretty significant cost, I would say. Like, as Warlock, you're already life tapping. Depending on if you're playing like Flush Giant, maybe you have some other way to deal damage to yourself. So it can be pretty scary to just punch yourself in the face for another 3 damage. But Warlock also plays a pretty reasonable amount of healing, so I think you can probably get away with it. And in Priest, like a lot of times you're going to be at 30 health when you play this, and then you can just hero power back up to 30 anyway. The damage is actually maybe at its scariest in Zoo, because you're potentially playing like Flame Imp as well. So if you like Flame Imp and then Raise Dead a Flame Imp and play it again, that's 9 damage that you're taking. Plus you're life tapping a lot in Zoo, so that is pretty scary. But still, in Zoo, 0 mana, draw 2 cards. Seems pretty efficient. I think this card just fits in so many different archetypes, it fits in both classes. I think it's very likely to see play at some point. Next up we have another Priest spell, Draconic Studies. 1 mana, discover a dragon. Your next one costs 1 less. So let's take a look at the dragons available to the Priest class. Their class dragons are, you know, pretty reasonable. You can land a Fate Weaver if you're playing that kind of deck. Chrono Breaker tends to not be that good, but like Eon Reaver, Skeletal Dragon, Murozond, those are all pretty good dragons. Some of the neutrals are a bit stinky. You don't want to be hitting like Fairy Dragon and what I assume is probably a control deck. Maybe even like Twilight Drake is kind of sketchy. But for the most part, it is probably a pretty high value thing that you're discovering. And because of the discount, if you discover, you know, like an evasive Draken and you can play that on turn 6, that is pretty reasonable. My main issue with this card, you can actually do some kind of scammy stuff with Malygos too, maybe. Although Priest doesn't have any base damage spells anymore, I don't think. But my main reservation with this card is just like, what deck are you playing this in? I don't think Galakrond Priest really has the room for this, although maybe it's just like a better effect than Thoughtsteal potentially. It's just kind of like a dumb value thing anyway. And it's better at activating Spell Burst than Thought Steal is. So that could be a thing. But Priest is already deciding to play Thought Steal over, say, over like a Psychic Conjure, so maybe they really do appreciate that second bit of value. Although maybe that's mitigated somewhat by Draconic Studies so often being able to pick something big. Although I'm not necessarily sure that picking something big is always going to be good in this deck, because like you're already getting so much stuff off of Galakron, and you got some other expensive stuff, so I don't know. It's a bit of a sketchy card in Galakron Priest, I would say. And like buff Priest is certainly not interested in an effect like this. I don't think there's like a full-blown Dragon Priest or anything. So I'm not super in love with this card, but it's definitely like reasonable enough that it's not unplayable. Next we have a Priest Legendary, Mindrender Illucia. 2 mana 1/3, Battle Cry. Swap hands and decks with your opponent until your next turn. So this card is really insane because it basically says Priest can never lose to a combo deck again. At least not a combo deck that has like specific important cards. Because you just get to 10 mana, take your opponent's hand, and then well, I guess if they're like a Malagos deck, you can't necessarily play the Malagos. But you can play like the Moonfires or the Swipes or whatever that they've been stockpiling, and then they can't actually kill you with that combo. And Priest, as a greedy control class, is kind of naturally preyed upon by combo decks. So that's a pretty insane card to add to their arsenal. Especially since they don't actually even have to put it in their deck. They can just generate it with Galakron or whatever. But I think if there are any combo decks in the meta, Priest is pretty happy to just play this card. Because, like, it's not like it's just good against combo either. You can play this against in like a control matchup and just hold on to it until you're in a position where your opponent's hand is probably scarier than yours after you've played your hero card and your Kronks or whatever. And then you can just play this and steal the opponent's, you know, Kalikos or Puzzle Box or whatever. Well, I guess you can't steal those, but you can steal their 8 mana thing instead. Steal their Power of Creation or their Deep Freeze or whatever, something along those lines. And then your opponent has your hand to work with the next turn, but they're stuck with, like, you know, Breath of the Infinite and stuff like that. Or you can even, in Priest, you can just let them have your Thought Steals and stuff because your hand is swapping back next turn anyway, so thanks for casting my Thought Steal for me, friend. But this card is also just like reasonably good against aggro as well, right? You play this when you have a handful of like 5, 8 mana cards. Just play this on curve and your opponent can't really develop anything for the following turn. Or you play this on like turn 4 and you steal, or like turn 5 against an aggro druid and you just play this and throw out Savage Roar or something like that. So it's got a lot of applications and a lot of different matchups, and it very effectively patches up one of Control Priest's really obvious weaknesses. So this card seems pretty insane, and depending on the meta, I could see this being extremely influential in the meta. Next we have Power Word Feast, a Priest spell. 2 mana, give a minion +2/+2, restore it to full health at the end of this turn. So it seems like Priest is having a lot of like tempo buff stuff being pushed, and if there's anything that can make it viable, I think it's probably this card. This card seems really strong to me. In the past, we've seen some cards that give +2/+2 and have some amount of upside or whatever, and those cards have been pretty good. There was Earthen Might, I think the Shaman one was called, and like Mark of Yasharaj and Druid way back in the day. Actually, I guess the best comparison is Extra Arms, when that was temporarily buffed to be only 2 mana and then had to be re-nerfed. So yeah, giving something +2/+2 in Priest we know is a powerful effect. And particularly with the Frazzled Freshman, the 1 mana 1/4 that Priest is getting, but really just on like any 1-drop that sticks. You land this on like your 1/2, very solid. Reliquary of Souls as well, maybe like Blazing Battle Mage. Like any 1-drop you land this on is pretty good. You get like a 3/4, 3/5, 4/4, whatever. And then you value trade with it and immediately get the health back that you just traded off with. So actually in a lot of cases, instead of +2/+2, it's like 2 mana +2 +4 or +5 or whatever. Or you can even land this in the mid game with, you know, some like 5/5, and then you make it a 7/7, trade it into their 5/5, and you heal back up that 5 damage. So it's 2 mana, give your thing +2/+7. Just a very disgustingly efficient card if you have stuff in play and care about value trading into your opponent's stuff. But even the floor on this card where you don't value trade with it, like 2 mana give something +2/+2, is just a fine card. So if there's like some sort of buff priest, it absolutely plays this card, and it's going to be a nightmare to play against this deck if they manage to stick a bigger minion than you can kill for really like any turn. Next we have Initiation. 6 mana, deal 4 damage to a minion. If that kills it, summon a new copy. So I guess you compare this to Holy Water, another card that was available to the Priest class, which was deal 4 damage to a minion if that kills it, add a copy to your hand. So for 1 more minion, you get to just summon that copy. Holy Water was pretty trash at 5 mana, but I think Initiation, even putting the card in play, is still pretty trash at 6 mana. It's a really situational removal card, and like a lot of the stuff you're killing, you don't even really care that much about resummoning to your side of the board anyway. Like if you're killing like a 3/3, like an SI7 agent or something, just 6 mana, kill their 3/3, make a 3/3 is really just not worth it. Even if you're killing like a 4/4, not really worth it. You can kill bigger stuff, like you can kill your opponent's Ysera or something, deal 8 damage to it through other means, and then finish it off with Initiation. But Priest is actually not very good at doing that, since a lot of their removal is just like targeted destroy, Shadow or Death or Time Warp or whatever. They're not actually good at killing stuff that's much bigger. And just in general, like I think I'd rather Time Warp something for 5 than initiate it for 6. I think this card is just way too situational and too low of a power level. Next we have Plagiarize, a new 2 mana rogue secret. At the end of your opponent's turn, add copies of the cards they played to your hand. So this is an interesting sort of secret. It's not something that your opponent can like not trigger for multiple turns. I assume it just always goes off at the end of their next turn, unless they just don't play any cards, which I guess you're happy with. But I can't really imagine this card seeing too much play. It's kind of just like a dumb value thing. But Rogue really is not struggling with value at the moment. They have so much lackey generation, and then the lackeys, of course, they generate more stuff. You have a lot of card draw with Greyheart Sage and Galakron to keep your hand full, Pharaoh Cat as well. So random resource generation is just not something that Rogue is really struggling with at the moment. And also just like as a secret, this isn't something that's going to stick around for multiple turns to activate your Blackjack Stunner. It is something that kind of gets out of the way for your Hanar, but then like your Hanar is the thing generating all your value. So I mostly just think this card is kind of sketchy. Your opponent can also just play around it to an extent, and if you play this like in the early game, a lot of times you're just getting like a 3-drop or something from it. It's just not really a card that lines up that well. Really just at all, but particularly with what Rogue is currently capable of doing. Next we have a Rogue weapon, Self-Sharpening Sword. 3 mana 1/4, after your hero attacks gain +1 attack. So the first time you use this is going to be a 1/4, the 4th time you use it, it's going to be a 4 power weapon. I do think this card is like, I mean, it's like 10 damage from this card, just 3 mana deal 10 damage over 4 turns. But that is pretty slow, it's a slow card in general. And particularly like on turn 3, on turn 4. dealing 1 damage to a minion is pretty low impact, even dealing 2 damage to it on turn 4. It's going to be hard to really hit good kills with this. But if you're playing any weapon buffs, this card is really insane. Like if you land a Deadly Poison on this card, it's going to deal 3, 4, 5, 6 damage, which is 18 over 4 turns. 18 is a lot. And then of course you can always play a second Deadly Poison, puts it up to 26, I believe. That's a lot of potential damage out of this card. And there's also some like weapon synergy stuff. This does line up okay with the Steel Dancer. You can attack twice with this before playing Steel Dancer on turn 4 and getting a random 3-drop. But ultimately, I think Rogue might just have some better weapons that they're interested in playing. Waggle Pick is still available. Hooked Scimitar is available. Those are both 4 power immediately. The Self-Sharpening Sword is 10 over 4 turns, but those 2 weapons are 8 over 2 turns, which is certainly more like damage efficient per turn. They don't scale as well off of buffs, but I think just in general they're going to be a little bit stronger. They're also better at activating, like Dread Corsair or something like that. So the Self-Sharpening Sword, certainly reasonable if you can buff it, but if you're not buffing it, I think I'd rather just play weapons that Rogue already has access to. Next up is a Rogue minion, Vulpera Toxinblade. 3 mana 3/3, your weapon has +2 attack. So a reasonable buff for the Self-Sharpening Sword we just looked at. But this isn't a battle cry, it's just while this is in play. So there's actually a pretty good chance that this is only active for 1 turn. But 3 mana 3/3 cast half of a Deadly Poison is actually just a pretty good card. Even if you're not landing it on a Self-Sharpening Sword or a Hooked Scimitar or something, this is actually just pretty good on your Rune Dagger that you're normally making on turn 2 and then curving into this. In that sense, it's kind of like an SI7 agent that didn't need to be comboed. So, definitely looks like a very reasonable card. Rogue does have some deck space issues with like Galakron packages, stealth, secret packages, maybe a Vendetta package. So it is a little bit hard to squeeze into the deck, but it's a very efficient card for really any archetype of Rogue, whether you're like some mid-rangey Galakron kill your opponent eventually kind of thing, or whether you're just like straight up aggro Rogue. This is damage that you can put into your opponent's face. Seems like a reasonable card, but not one that I'm not clicking create new Rogue deck and then immediately putting 2 Vulpera Toxinblades in it. Next we have Shifty Sophomore, 4 mana 4/4 stealth. Spell Burst, add a combo card to your hand. Well, 4 mana 4/4 stealth is not a super strong stat line. We have in the past seen Coppertail Imposter, I believe the card was called, which was basically a 4 mana 4/4 stealth, even had some mech synergy. And if I remember correctly, I don't believe this card ever really saw much play. But nowadays, Rogue does have some stealth synergy. So like this is an activator for Greyheart Sage, which is pretty nice. This can also be buffed by Ashtongue Slayer, another stealth synergy that Rogue has. But even without those stealth synergies, it kind of has self synergy, right? Because it's a spell burst card that you can just play on curve, and because it has stealth, it's probably going to survive until your next turn. And actually, I think the effect of adding a combo card to your hand is pretty strong, because the range of combo cards is pretty narrow, and for the most part, they're all like kind of fine. There's a lot of damage in the combo cards actually. Cold Blood, Eviscerate, Hooked Scimitar, Head Crack, SI7 Agent, Perdition's Blade. Like half of the combo cards deal damage to the opponent's face. So that's pretty strong. I mean, there are certainly some stinkers. You probably don't want to be hitting Necreum Apothecary or Shadow Sculptor. But like even Kidnapper, if you're playing an aggro deck, just get a taunt out of the way. It's not completely terrible. I do think the effect on this card is pretty strong. It's just a matter of, is there a deck that cares about a 4/4 stealth and cares about activating this spell burst and can actually activate this spell burst? Like, if you just jammed this into this current build of Stealth Galakron Rogue, you do have double Backstab, double Shadow Step, double Praise Galakron, so you probably could actually activate this pretty often. And because of the stealth, even like Seal Fate's a pretty good activator for it. And then of course the Grey Heart Sage synergy as well. So this could actually be pretty good in the deck like this. It is like a value thing in this deck though, and with so much Lackey generation, I don't know that Rogue really cares about a value thing like this. But maybe it has more of a home in like an aggro stealth rogue deck. Something that actually cares about playing Ash Tongue Slayer. Cares about a stealth minion just hitting the opponent in the head. I don't know if that kind of deck is going to be able to activate the spell burst that reliably. So it is a bit of a weird card in that sense. But I don't think this card should be written off just based on its power level alone. Finding a home for it might be difficult though. Next up we have Coerce, a spell for Rogue and Warrior. 3 mana, destroy a damaged minion, or combo destroy any minion. So 3 mana Assassinate is a very strong card, but on the low end, 3 mana Execute is not the strongest card. So it's a little bit difficult to say how good of a removal spell this is going to be. In Warrior, the low end of it obviously compares poorly to Execute, but it's not actually always easy to activate Execute in Warrior, so maybe Coerce ends up being a better card. But like in the sort of Warrior decks that want to play Execute, it wouldn't even always be that easy to combo this card either. But I guess you can always like Sword and board a small minion and then Coerce a big minion or something. But in general, I do think this card might be a little bit awkward in Warrior decks. And when we look at playing it in Rogue, for one, Rogue has a ton of deck space issues, but then on top of that, if Rogue wants an effect like this, they can just play Sap, and I'm not sure that this card is better than Sap. So this might end up being one of those cards that's like pretty efficiently costed. It's a pretty fine card, but it's just kind of outclassed by Sap and Execute, and might end up not seeing too much play because of that. It would also need to find a deck that's interested in playing this, and a deck that's not so tight, like the Galakron Rogues or like the Enraged Warriors with all of their mandatory risky skippers and Bloodsworn Mercenaries and all that kind of stuff. So definitely a powerful card, but it might struggle to find a home. Maybe that big warrior with like Dimensional Rippers that seems to be being pushed would be a good spot for this to see some play. Next up, another rogue/warrior card, Cutting Class. 5 mana, draw 2 cards, costs 1 less per attack of your weapon. Holy shit, this card is insane. I'm pretty sure that this card is nuts, and this card might be the reason that both of these classes have a pretty successful aggro deck. Rogue can play this with Hooked Scimitar and Waggle Pick. Those are 4 power weapons that make this 1 mana draw 2, which is insanely strong. Rogue is also probably playing Deadly Poison, maybe Krastenov, maybe Greenskin. So you can pretty easily get this to be 0 mana, draw 2 cards as well. I think Warrior can use this pretty efficiently as well. If they are playing like Arcanite Reaper, this is 0 mana. Even if they're just playing Wrench Caliber, 2 mana draw 2 is quite strong. Warrior is getting a 4 power weapon in this set that's pretty good with Cutting Class. They of course also have access to like Upgrade and the same Greenskin, Krastenov stuff that Rogue has. So this is just a really ridiculous card draw card. And I think like Pirate Warrior and some sort of aggro rogue might be relevant in the meta pretty much because of the existence of this card. It's just such an efficient card draw option for 2 archetypes that are just interested and drawing into more damage. Next up, we have a Shaman weapon, Rune Dagger. 2 mana 1/3. After your hero attacks, gain spell damage +1 this turn. So this card seems pretty insane to me. Shaman has a lot of spells that deal damage. Probably the most notable of them is going to be Lightning Storm. It's pretty often that you have to 50-50 things with Lightning Storm, but with the Rune Dagger, suddenly instead of 2 to 3 damage, you're dealing 3 to 4. That kills way more stuff, especially like on turn 3, on turn 4. And you can just curve this, turn 2 Rune Dagger, turn 3 Lightning Storm. So that's very efficient. But it's also just pretty good with like Serpent Shrine Portal as well, just like a single target thing. It's good for their bigger AoEs like Hagatha's Scheme and even particularly Earthquake as well, since it applies to both halves of Earthquake. It's also just like a reasonable aggressive card because it buffs up your Lightning Bolts and your Lava Bursts. There's also like the new legendary Ras Frost Whisper that gets a buff from the Rune Dagger. And on top of just having the on-demand spell damage, which we know is good because a lot of times Shaman just has to roll for spell damage totem and hope they hit it. But on top of that, you're also just getting to poke something for 1 every time you use this. So I think it's just a really efficient card. There's also some like spell damage synergy stuff available to Shaman in this set that we haven't gotten to yet. It's just good. It's just a good card. Might even use it to enable Arcane Watcher. Pretty sick synergy as well. I really like Rune Dagger. Next up we have a Shaman spell, Molten Blast. 3 mana, deal 2 damage, summon that many 1/1 elementals. So this is something you want to use with the Rune Dagger, because it deals damage, but also it like double scales off the damage. So it says deal 2 damage, summon that many 1/1 elementals. But if you deal 3 damage, then you're summoning 3 1/1 elementals. If you deal 4 damage, you're summoning 4 1/1 elementals. So in that sense, the card is very comparable to the old Warlock spell that everyone loved to play against, Implosion. You deal some amount of damage and summon 1/1s equal to the amount of damage dealt. This is cheaper than Implosion, and with even 1 spell damage, it's very comparable. It just basically is the average of Implosion. And Shaman, of course, has easy access to spell damage. They just got the Rune Dagger. They have their Totem. They have some pretty reasonable spell damage cards of their own with Lady Vosh and Squall Hunter. And then, of course, they can play like Blood Mage Thalnos or whatever. So I think it's pretty easy to get this up to dealing 3 damage. But like even if it only deals 2 damage, it's not that bad. Like the floor on it is fine, considering how high the ceiling can be. And it also is just a damage spell that can go face, so that's pretty good for murdering your opponents, which every class, including Shaman, likes to do. So it seems like a pretty efficient card. I don't know if it's really good enough to just like slot into Totem Shaman, but when your curve is hero power into spell damage totem, and then you just copy it a shitload of times, and then you can Molten Blast the opponent for like 6. That's kind of sick. Although I guess then you don't really have the board space to get all the 1/1 elementals. It's still pretty sick though. But yeah, if there's a spell damage Shaman, I think this is definitely a card you're interested in playing in that deck. Next up we have a Shaman Legendary, which based purely on its art, seems to me like it should be a mage card, but whatever. Instructor Fireheart, 3 mana 3/3 Battlecry. Discover a spell that costs 1 or more. If you play it this turn, repeat this effect. So, discover a spell on a 3-drop. Vulpera Scoundrel is a card that has seen a reasonable amount of play. It's even seen some play in Shaman. So, Instructor Fireheart is Vulpera Scoundrel, but with +1 attack basically. And then on top of that, you also can't discover 0 mana spells, which Shaman has a lot of shitty situational 0 mana spells, so that definitely cuts out some of the worst parts of Shaman. And then on top of that, any spell you discover that's playable lets you spend some mana to discover another spell. So basically, any turn you play this, you're going to be able to spend all of your mana relatively efficiently. So overall, just seems like a very strong card. Certainly, control decks can use this effect a little bit more than aggro decks because they just tend to use more mana and get up to the higher mana totals in the game. But it's pretty good in aggro as well. You can just discover like a couple lightning bolts or something. I saw an excellent meme with this card. Let's see if I can remember what this card is even called. With Dwarven Archaeologist, after you discover a card, reduce its cost by 1. So turn 1, you double Lightning Bloom, you play Dwarven Archaeologist, Instructor Fireheart, and then you just discover infinite lightning bolts and kill the opponent. Pretty sick. But honestly, like, Dwarven Archaeologist is not bad with this card in general, because you can so consistently discover so many cards and keep getting more value out of it. I wonder if this card could actually see play. Probably not, but, you know, could see play. But yeah, just in general, Instructor Fireheart seems very good. It's good pretty much like every turn you play it, or every turn you like draw into it and could potentially play it. It's even good just on turn 3 as a slightly better Vulpera Scoundrel. Pretty good card for any Shaman deck, really. Next we have a Shaman spell, Tidal Wave. 8 mana, Lifesteal, deal 3 damage to all minions. So, in one of the early reviews, we saw a Demon Hunter AoE called Cycle of Hatred. That was 7 mana, deal 3 damage to everything, with some upside. And I mentioned that at this point in the game, 3 damage is really just like not good enough for an AoE. You compare this to like Flame Strike, which really hasn't been that good of a card for a long time. Flame Strike is 1 mana cheaper than this and does 1 more damage. So Tidal Wave looks kinda sketchy. But the thing is, it does have lifesteal. So even if it's not clearing the opponent's board, it's still healing you for probably like 12 or whatever. So if you're healing for 12 and leaving up like 6 power or something, that's still like fine for you. And then you can clean up even more next turn with single target spells or like a Hagatha Scheme or a Lightning Storm or something. So the lifesteal on this card is pretty powerful. There's also the consideration that Shaman has access to some pretty efficient spell damage, particularly from the Rune Dagger, I believe it was called. So it's pretty easy to get this to deal 4 damage AoE, which starts to look a lot more reasonable. And then of course the lifesteal scales off of any spell damage that you put into this. So that's pretty nice. It's also just like, if you want to play a Highlander Shaman, it's kind of nice to just have access to another AoE on top of Earthquake and Hagatha's Scheme. Also, compared to like Flame Strike or Cycle of Hatred or whatever, this AoE, like if you land it against aggro, not only do you clear their board, hopefully, but you also just get to put yourself out of range of their top decked fireball or whatever. So this is like actually a game ender if it lines up well as a board clear, whereas like Flame Strike is not necessarily. So I think this is like a fair card, a reasonable card. But as much as I tried to like separate it from those other sort of inefficient big AoEs, it still is an 8 mana AoE that's only dealing 3 damage. So it's at least going to be pretty meta dependent, and quite potentially it's just not going to be a good enough board clear. Next up we have a Warlock spell, Draconic Studies. 1 mana, discover a demon, your next one costs 1 less. I think of all the studies, this is probably one of the less exciting ones. Discovering demons, there's not really a ton that I'm like super excited to discover. I guess if you wanted to play this in like Zoo, there's a lot of 1-drops you could hit, so this is basically just like another 1-drop. I actually wonder what the odds on hitting a 1-drop demon are. Probably not that high. And there's also like a lot of neutral demons that are really shitty and you would never want to discover. Like, holy shit, Mad Summoner, Scavenging Shavara, Supreme Abyssal. There are some real stinkers in the demon pool. And depending on your archetype, like if you're Zoo or something, you'd never want to discover Moarg Artificer. If you're Control, you wouldn't care about discovering Frenzied Fellwing. So I think this is like a pretty sketchy card just based on the pool of stuff that you're discovering. But you can also just use it as like a ramp card. Use this to get Jiraxis out a turn early, or use it to like turn 10 be able to hero power in the Jiraxis turn, which is kind of cute. Maybe there's something that you can do with discounting Betrug, but you can already plot twist with Betrug, so that's probably not super relevant. I don't know. I just don't really see much of a home for this card. I don't think the Discover pool for it is particularly good, and I just don't really think it's one of the more powerful things you can be doing in the Scholomance Academy expansion. Next up, we have another Studies card, this time for Warrior. Athletic Studies. 1 mana and discover a rush minion. Your next one costs 1 less. So let's take a look at the rush minions available to the Warrior class. You definitely have some good ones. Restless Mummy, Bloodboil Brute, Kargath, Scion of Rune if you're playing a Galakron deck. But some of the neutrals are pretty shitty. You don't really want to be discovering Burly Shovelfist or Batterhead, or really don't want to be discovering too many of these. Actually, Devoted Maniac. Maybe this is like particularly good in Galakron Warrior or something. But I think the pool on this is not super great. And also just as a card, it doesn't really have a very high ceiling. Like, you discover another Restless Mummy, that's like kind of okay. But are you really putting a card in your deck hoping that can happen? I don't think so. It seems a little bit low impact for Control Warriors. And something like Enraged Warrior would never have the deck space to play a card like this. Like all the other studies, you can kind of use this as like a ramp effect. You can get Bloodboil Brute down a turn earlier, make a risky skipper combo a little bit more easy on the mana. But I just don't see this card being strong enough or finding a home. Next we have another Warrior spell, In Formation. 2 mana, add 2 random taunt minions to your hand. So this reminds me of Dragon Roar, I think that's what that card was called. Also a Warrior card. Also 2 mana, also add 2 random pieces of garbage to your hand. Dragon Roar was a pretty bad card. It did occasionally see some play, but it was a pretty shitty card. And I think dragons are significantly better than random taunt minions. So, I have to expect that this card is pretty shitty as well. I mean, if you're getting random taunt minions, you're getting Goldshire Footman and Frostwolf Grunt. And on the top end, you're getting unplayable shit like Living Monument, Heroic Innkeeper. It's just not a great card. And I don't really know. Like, even in Control Warrior, there have to be better ways to add some value to your deck than this. I guess it is some added synergy for Into the Fray and the 6-drop, the Armadillo thing. But there's just no way that's ever good enough to make this card see play. Next up we have a Warrior weapon, Reaper's Scythe. 4 mana 4/2 spell burst also damages adjacent minions this turn. This is just a very efficient weapon. 4 mana 4/2 is already like pretty good. We've seen from True Silver, Hooked Scimitar, stuff like that. It's just a solid weapon. If you do manage to spell burst this, it's an insane board control tool. I don't know how easy of a time Warrior necessarily has spell bursting this. I guess like Inner Rage is a really cheap way to do it. Upgrade is actually probably the most insane thing you could do with this. And yeah, if you're killing 3 minions with 1 weapon swing, especially on like turn 4 or 5 where it's early enough for that to be relevant, this card is disgustingly good. But it doesn't actually have to be that good to see play. Like, maybe you just play this in Pirate Warrior, mostly ignoring the spell burst effect. Cut Arcanite Reaper because I think a 4 mana 4/2 is better than a 5 mana 5/2 on a weapon. Maybe you even replace your Livewire Lance with a second copy of this, and then you can play, I think it was called Cutting Class, the thing that draws cards and gets discounted based on the power of your weapon. 4 power on a weapon is very good for that card. Reaper Scythe just seems pretty good, whether you can activate the spell burst or not. I don't know that like in Rage Warrior is necessarily going to be cutting their live wire lances for this card, because I think they probably appreciate the value. But who knows, maybe even in Rage Warrior just wants to smork a little bit harder and includes the Reaper Scythe. I think this card is just pretty good. Like, even Control can play this card. It's, like some Control Warriors, unless you're playing like Bulwark of Azeroth, it's not super easy to abuse Corsair Cache, and Reaper's Scythe is a way that you could abuse Corsair Cache in decks that otherwise maybe couldn't quite force it the way they wanted to. Maybe this is even fine in like the Dimensional Ripper Warrior. I think in general this is just a good card that's quite likely to see some play.